Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Laura Llewellyn. I am Associate Curator of Renaissance Painting here at the gallery. And after 2 days of extremely rich and stimulating papers, it is my very great pleasure to chair the final panel, which will explore Raphael's legacy. Our first speaker, Luca Barocci, is a PhD candidate at Scuola Normale in Pisa. His research focuses on the relationship between drawing, painting, and printmaking, and he's currently revising the catalogue raisonné of Federico Barocci. And it is on this artist and his relationship with Raphael that he will focus today in his talk. So please welcome Luca Barocci.
Thank you. It is a great pleasure to speak about this topic here. 2022 for the National Gallery is Raphael's year, of course, but it was 10 years ago that the same museum dedicated to Barocci in 2012, a very important exhibition. So that's probably the best place to speak about this topic, apart, of course, after Urbino. On July 27, 1494, Giovanni Santi makes his will in Urbino. 2 persons are at his deathbed, his collaborator, Evangelista da Pian di Meleto, and his friend and colleague, the sculptor Ambrogio Barocci. Neither Giovanni nor Ambrogio were born in Urbino, but had moved there some 20 years before, attracted by the splendor and magnificence of the Montefeltro court. Both, protected by Duke Federico da Montefeltro, made their fortune, obtaining economic and social reputation. Giovanni became an intimate of the Duke and a talented man of letters, while Ambrogio established himself as the head of a busy workshop. In the following years, Giovanni's only son, Raphael, will leave Urbino to build himself a career in Perugia, Florence, and Rome. The Baroccis, on the contrary, stayed in town as notaries, jurists, and wealthy landowners, forming familiar relationship with distinguished local families of artists, such as the Gengas. It is around 1533 that Ambrogio's great-grandson, Federico, is born. Named after Federico da Montefeltro, he is raised as a nobleman. His early inclination towards painting is welcomed by the family, proud of the fact that their ancestor adorned the ducal palace of Urbino with decorations and relief so elegant that in 1502 they earned themselves a place in Leonardo da Vinci's travel sketchbook. Federico's inclination for painting was not just a personal matter. Since Raphael's death in 1520, the people of Urbino had complained the unexpected loss of such a personality, who left the world before being able to leave a major work in the hometown, whose name he had so proudly included in his signature. Between 1530 and 1540, during Barocci's childhood, this absence was partially filled by the Duke Francesco Maria I della Rovere, who programmatically linked Raphael's visual fortune to the famous local production of Maiolica ware. For this purpose, he purchased hundreds, if not thousands, of reproductive prints after Raphael, making them available to the Maiolica painters in Urbino, Gubbio, and Pesaro. This drawing by the Maiolica maker from Urbania, Cipriano Piccolpasso, which is in the V&A, shows the interior of a Maiolica workshop and was made shortly after Barocci's juvenile trainship in Pesaro. Pinned to the wall are drawings and prints that serve as models for the young apprentice. Judging from the Maiolica ware that has come down to us, it seems likely that a large portion of these sheets were based on Raphael's inventions, making him the most powerful source of visual narrative in the Urbino Duchy. The systematic introduction of Raphaelesque motifs in the figurative production, however, was not enough to satisfy the cultural ambitions of the Duchy. What was needed was a new local artist, a champion who would bring the pallium of Italian painting back to Urbino. although this may sound vaguely Victorian, both the written and printed sources, such as Lomazzo's 1587 Libro dei Grotteschi, stick to such a narrative that Barocci made his own throughout his career. This is, for example, a passage from Barocci's funerary oration, written by the ducal librarian Vittorio Venturelli in 1612, quote, "Painting was brought back to its pristine grandeur by the great Raphael from Urbino, who emulated antiquity with the excellence of his knowledge and with the richness of his ingenuity, being able to make eternal his name and to raise his homeland a trophy worthy of true honor. From the deep darkness of oblivion in which a profession once so celebrated was miserably buried, he managed to push the art of painting into the brightest light of glory. Consider, therefore, O illustrious gentlemen, that Barocci was not born in some simple market town, or in a small and cramped castle, or an ignoble and unknown place, but in the most bright city of Urbino, whence the most famous painters in the world flourished and got their vital aura, and where he chose to live and die. Around this he chose to live and die is gathered most of the complicated relation between Barocci and Raphael. The latter evidently had chosen to do that far from Urbino, and even if the topic is somewhat more complex, one can affirm that a relevant part of Barocci's 6 years-long career was devoted to fill this gap. He pledged to glorify his homeland, thus becoming not simply an excellent artist, but an extension of Raphael himself, or, as Giulio Cesare Gigli wrote in 1615, quote, "the renovated glory of Urbino." Although being apparently there for everyone to see, Barocci's artistic depth towards Raphael is surprisingly hard to circumstance. Federico's very character led him to hide instead of showing his sources of inspiration, as elegantly stated by a major connoisseur of both artists, John Sherman, quote, "The unexpected is easier to cope with than the obvious. The latter can be hard to pin down when Barocci has exhausted its possibilities in the preparatory process, that in the end little tangible remains. Of Raphael's miraculous draught of the fishes, for example, only the crustacean on the shore of the Colli of St. Andrew. For this reason, it is important to stick to the essentials. Where, how, and when did Barocci make contact with Raphael's work? Let's get started with some basic topography. This aerial view of the so-called Monte delle Vigne, or Mount of Vineyards, shows the area of Urbino where, like a modern Bloomsbury or Montparnasse, all the men of letters, artists, and artisans gathered, establishing close family and economic relationship. Raphael's family house stood a few meters away from the lodgings where, in 1467-68, Paolo Uccello had lived while painting the Miracle of the Host. 3 doors up the hill was, and still is, Timoteo Viti's house. Barocci's lived just as close in the former Via San Giovanni, adorned by the beautiful oratory frescoed by the Salimbeni brothers. Barocci's house, that also contained the watchmaker shop of his cousins Giovanni Maria and Giovanni Battista, was also bordering that of the mathematician Federico Commandino, who in 1573 established there the first publishing and printing press in town, building the torque from which Barocci will print his beautiful and innovative etchings. Rightly halfway between Raphael's and Barocci's house was the no more extant oratory of St. Margaret, where Federico executed at the age of 21 his very first altarpiece, a lost martyrdom of St. Margaret executed in 1554. Its aspect can be imagined through the sources and a slightly later drawing for a similar composition preserved in the V&A. Not surprisingly, the painting depicting St. Margaret and the dragon was a direct homage to Raphael. This inspiration is even more evident in Barocci's second altarpiece, the 1556 St. Cecily, painted for the Urbino Cathedral and directly inspired, probably through Marcantonio's reverse print, to Raphael's masterpiece in Bologna. However, a closer look to the painting suggests that, up to this moment, Barocci's knowledge or interest in Raphael's pictorial style was limited. The handling of the painting is much closer to the acid tones of his master, Battista Franco, and to those of the team of artists, namely Francesco Menzocchi and Raffaellino del Colle, who decorated the Villa Imperiale in Pesaro while he was a little boy. Therefore, to find some more relevant traces, we need to turn to a much more intimate and delicate technique, drawing, whose general discussion pertains to the still little explored topic of drawing collecting in the Urbino Duchy during the 16th century. As well known, Raphael left most of his graphic material to his Roman pupils, who after the sack of Rome of 1527 spread it throughout Italy and Europe. The documents, however, attest how, after the great man's death, local artists and collectors concurred to gather in his hometown, if not his unattainable paintings, at least some of his drawings. The most famous example, but let's remember, not the only one, is the famous Viti Antaldi collection, a group of drawings dispersed on the British market at the beginning of the 19th century, but whose origin dates back to the personal collection of Raphael's collaborator, Timoteo Viti. Timoteo died in Urbino in 1523, and as far as we know, many of his own drawings and an incredibly rich selection of Raphael's ones were preserved by his descendants into his house, where they would have been easily accessible to the young Barocci. The well-known collector mark that attests the Antaldi provenance was opposed only during the 18th century, when many of the best pieces had probably gone. However, the original richness of the group is described by no less than Pierre-Jean Mariette in his account of Pierre Crozat's visit to Urbino in 1714. Quote, "There has perhaps never been a larger collection of Raphael drawings than the one presented here. Monsieur Crozat had collected it with great effort, and the cabinet that gave him the greatest number of them is that of the Viti family of Urbino. They preserve with immense care those that Timoteo, an ancestor of theirs, had brought back to Urbino when he retired there. These Viti drawings are almost all in pen, and although drawn with a very light sign, they show a perfect confidence in the stroke and expression. If we should have an idea of Raphael inferior to his merits, it is these drawings that we have to look at, as they show the sublimity of his genius. The other artists threw their first thoughts on paper, struggling to achieve what they needed. Raphael, on the contrary, brought to light the signs already formed in his mind, without the need of further retouching. It is then not surprising if in the post-mortem inventory of Barocci's studio, drawn up by his pupil from Perugia, Felice Pellegrini, during the autumn of 1612, among, quote, 15 books large, middling, small, almost all drawn by the hand of Signor Barocci, is mentioned one book by the hand of Raphael, with 80 pages drawn in wash, chiaroscuro, in pen, nude figures, draped figures, children, women, animals, and much besides, which it would take a long time to relate, all by the hand of Raphael. Unfortunately, we don't know the fate or nature of these drawings. Maybe Barocci had obtained them through the Viti family, to which he was linked by a distant kinship. But in at least one case, history has kept track of this otherwise unknown Raphaelesque treasure. At the end of the 1650s, Filippo Baldinucci, secretary of the Cardinal Leopoldo de' Medici, approached a priest from Urbino, Giovanni Battista Staccoli, asking him to send to Florence descriptions of all the collection of drawings in Urbino, which the cardinal intended to purchase to form what is today the Uffizi collection. Between December 28, 1658 and October 25, 1659, Staccoli mediated between Baldinucci and the heir of Barocci's studio, his nephew Ambrogio, for the purchase of a large stock of drawings, which included many drawings by Barocci and, quote, a drawing by Raphael representing a St. George or a St. Chrysantine. It is difficult not to connect Baldinucci's description to one of the two drawings on this subject, both by Raphael, preserved today in the Uffizi, where they are both attested at least since the 18th century. Significantly, one of the earliest known drawing by Barocci, preparatory for a maiolica plate and probably executed in the early 1550s, deals with the same subject, making us reflect on the actual possibility that he was working after original models by Raphael. Together with original Raphael drawings, the same 1612 inventory also mentions a consistent group of, quote, many drawings copied from Raphael and other worthy men made by Barocci when he was young. Until recently, it was commonly assumed that none of these drawings is extant today, but recent research has shown that this is not entirely true. A small group of drawings in the Uffizi, purchased by Leopoldo de' Medici in 1658 from Barocci's heir, resulted to be part of a small sketchbook executed by Barocci in Rome during his first study trip, occurred, according to Bellori, when the artist reached the age of 20, that is, about 1553. The tiny pages are filled with copies after Roman sculptors, anatomical sketches, and, as recently pointed out by David, Exurgent, a tiny bronze figure casted by another young artist who was wandering in Rome in the very same month, the French sculptor Barthélemy Prieur. Together with these, there is also a sketch in red chalk that is a 101 replica of the figure of Jesus in one of Raphael's most intimate early paintings, the National Gallery Madonna of the Pinks. Another drawing of a child by Barocci in the Berlin Kupferstick cabinet provide a less striking but equally plausible comparison, suggesting that at a certain point of Barocci's juvenile career, Raphael represented not only the talented genius who could put together vast and heroic compositions, but also one of the very few masters that had managed to portray convincingly babies, some of the most recalcitrant models of all time. Here and there, scattered among Barocci's huge corpus, a few more drawings attest the artist's juvenile studies after Raphael. Most of these sheets are of little interest and have come down to us only because the support on which they are made was reused for more accomplished composition. Among these are 3 barely legible copies after the Farnesina frescoes, respectively in the Uffizi, in the Fitzwilliam Museum, and in Urbania. This kind of generic copy, common to almost every artist of the 16th century, would be of little interest in this discussion if it wasn't for the Uffizi sketch, that at a closer look reveals itself as the key to uncover Barocci's exceptionally meticulous preparatory process. The drawing was originally part of a larger composition that probably included the sheet now in Urbania. On the verso, the figure carefully outlined in black chalk is easily recognizable as the Farnesina Mercury. What has passed so far unnoticed is that the drawing is traced in metal point, and that the exact trace left on the Uffizi sheet on your right can be identified in counterpart in another drawing in the Uffizi depicting a rising savior. The figure investigated again in a drawing in Budapest is connected with one of Barocci's most successful altarpieces, the Perdono di Assisi, executed between 1574 and 1579 for the Church of St. Francis in Urbino. The composition attests that Barocci had somehow merged 2 Raphaelesque models into one. The Farnesina Mercury had been given the same role and position of the rising Christ in the Transfiguration, in such a sophisticated mental and visual game that it would be impossible, if it wasn't for the drawings, to trace it back. Halfway through the creative process, however, Barocci let himself to be attracted by another model. Under a life-size sketch of the hand of St. Francis, the sheet on your left, today in the Dresden Kupferstick cabinet, is shown a careful copy of the rising Christ painted by Titian in 1542-44 on the processional banner of the Confraternity of the Corpus Domini in Urbino. Despite the similarity of the attitude, Titian Christ is more vital than Raphael's, with the bold detail of the foot seen from below that Barocci will quote literally in his composition. The juxtaposition of the preparatory drawings attests this radical change of sight, Between 1574 and 1579, during the 5 years that he spent working on the Perdono altarpiece, Barocci consciously decided to drop out the prestigious Raphaelesque model adopted in the first place to embrace Titian's more seductive manner. No wonder then that already in 1569, at the unveiling of his celebrated deposition in a stronghold of Raphaelism like Perugia, an eyewitness, conveniently named Raffaello Sotti, noted down in his diary, quote, "It is believed that this work, the deposition, will be held in high reputation by connoisseurs, as Barocci is the greatest imitator of Titian Vecellio, and as we can see in a truly new manner of painting, full of grace and of good taste in all his parts." This impression is reiterated by Barocci's most important patron, the Duke of Urbino Francesco Maria II della Rovere, who in 1584 wrote in a private letter that, quote, "Barocci's way of working is closer to Titian than it is to Raphael's." We will probably never know the true reason behind this change of heart. Titian's death in 1576 may have induced Barocci to pay homage to the master that since his 1538 Venus of Urbino, which he promptly copied in a juvenile drawing in Chatsworth, had been the Duke's most looked after foreign master. Quoting him so literally in the Perdono may have had an astute implication. After the disappearance of the great man, Barocci became the official painter of the Della Rovere court and one of the most respected artists in central Italy. Can we say that, just as he had grown up in the dream of becoming Raphael's local heir, the now 40 years old Barocci felt ready to add another coat of arms in his stylistic genealogy? The reference to Venice brings in discussion another distinctive quality of Barocci's drawings, whose origin can be traced back, albeit with a certain degree of caution, to Raphael's latent model. The lovers of Venetian art may remind an old unspoken disagreement between the scholars of Venetian and Central Italian painting regarding the quick spread of pastel drawing in Italy around 1550. The technique had been most likely imported from France by Leonardo and spread among his followers in early 1500s Lombardy, but it is only between 1560 and 1570, more or less, that two of the most talented draughtsmen in Italy, Jacopo Bassano and Federico Barocci, started to use it systematically, influencing their respective pupils and establishing a long-lasting model that will cross the Roman Baroque, reaching up to Rosalba Carriera. At the cost of appearing positivist, it does not seem inappropriate to investigate the origin of this interest in pastel. Was Barocci influenced by Bassano, or vice versa? Had Bassano, as it seemed most likely, got in touch with a Lombard tradition, whose roots went all the way back to Leonardo, or are there other players that might be considered in this extremely difficult chessboard? No answer, of course, is conclusive. The phenomenon is so vast and complex that it is probably impossible to elaborate a scheme capable of putting all the facts into an historical perspective. A little help, however, comes now from an unknown document which I am pleased to discuss here with you for the first time. The page you see here shows the recto and verso of one of the pages of Barocci's already mentioned juvenile sketchbook, executed in around 1553 during or immediately after a study trip to Rome. Now, the very feeble inscriptions ascribable to Barocci's hand that you see on the right can be decrypted as the earliest known descriptive list of the components of pastel that has come down to us. The inscription is in fact a very quick annotation, possibly a memorandum extracted from a more complex wall. No preparation process is described, so that we may interpret it as the equivalent of Michelangelo's famous shopping list. However, the presence of alum, of tragacant, wax, turpentine, mastic, and gilding chalk, a peculiar quality of chalk, also known as Bologna chalk, together with the Sibylline inscription Arte ibi disegnate, attest Barocci's early interest and knowledge towards pastel, an information which he must have noted down in Rome some 6 years before the earliest known pastel by Jacopo Bassano. rather than establishing futile and necessarily provisional primates, the information is relevant because it allows us to circumscribe the time and place of Barocci's first encounter with color drawing and pastel. The unpublished drawing you see here, passed unnoticed some years ago on the London art market, is the left portion of a larger bozzetto per I colori made by Barocci around 1560 to study the scene of the beautiful Holy Family painted on the vault of the Casino di Pio IV in the Vatican on your right. Unfortunately, the sheet has much suffered, but still shows the traces of a multifaceted attempt to transfer color onto paper. Watercolor, body color, black and red chalk are alternated in order to evocate the brightness of fresco, which Barocci executed, according to Bellori's words, quote, blending the colors so well that they appeared to be done in oil rather than in fresco, an observation particularly interesting if compared to what we saw earlier this morning about the Sala di Costantino. As well known, this enterprise was executed side by side with two of the most talented and promising artists working in Rome, Barocci's countrymen Taddeo and Federico Zuccaro, who in the very same month were also experimenting at various degrees with color drawing. The coincidence of handling and materials may be interpreted as a coincidence. However, a closer look to these beautiful expressions of graphic inventiveness confirms the presence of a common denominator and visual reference. As all three artists were from the Urbino Duchy, working in Rome at the very peak of the fortune of Michelangelo and of Tuscan artists, Michelangelo's work-in-progress dome was, as Barocci painted it right out of the window, it doesn't seem too reckless to me to identify this shared, common reference in the artist to see whose work Barocci had expressly visited Rome in the first place. Bellori again, quote, at the age of 20, stimulated by the desire for fame and by the name of his countryman Raphael, Federico resolved to go to Rome, where he copied the works of Raphael alongside two other youth. Personally, and also considering the availability of Raphael's graphic materials in Urbino, I find it plausible, or at least possible, that Federico's interest for his protector l'art went beyond simple iconography and may have extended to technique and materials. And working in Rome, both he, Taddeo, and Federico Zuccaro may have looked at Raphael not only as the champion of the use of black ink and red chalk, but as one of the inventors, at least from a central Italian perspective, of color drawing and more specifically of pastel drawing. So far, only two pastels have been convincingly attributed to Raphael, one currently visible in the National Gallery show and dated to the very last years of the master's activity, and one more debated, but at least to me perfectly right, in the Pembroke collection at Wilton House. Common sense suggests that there may have been others, probably soon deteriorated due to the great fragility, and may be elaborated as a consequence of Leonardo's stay in Rome in 1513. If so, and I reckon that this is a big if, Barocci's generation may have looked to Raphael also as one of the fathers of central Italian pastel drawing, and the progenitor of a small but highly significant group of works of art that has so far escaped a proper contextualization and dating. In particular, the British Museum portrait of a man with a hat, which I personally could never help but find incredibly Venetian in a Lotto man with a hat way, comes again from the Viti Antaldi collection, which means that it was visible in Urbino, where it is attested since the 1670s, during Barocci's times. In conclusion, and remaining in the highly exciting environment of the British Museum print room, let me to be provocative by reporting an episode occurred during the recent cataloguing of Barocci's drawings. Thanks to the courtesy of Hugo Chapman, I was able to work on a large group of handwritten notes regarding the Italian drawings in the collection made by Arthur E. Popham, the legendary keeper of the department, between 1945 and 1954. Many of his brilliant intuitions later converge in the catalogues of drawings published by John Gear and Philip Pouncey in 1962 and 1983. Some of them, however, were left out, making the notes a most stimulating and fascinating reading. At the very end of his biographical entry on Barocci, Popham adds an intriguing observation referred to a drawing preserved in the Piety department under a much sounder name, quote, "A drawing which I suspect may be by Barocci is the study of the Madonna di Foligno of Raphael, but it is not an attribution which can be demonstrated, and it is safer to leave it under Raphael's name." The well-known drawing, bequeathed to the BM in 1900 by Henry Vaughan, has been considered since a visual proof of Raphael's interest for the Venetian world, thanks to its atmospheric use of black chalk and the choice of a peculiar support, blue paper, which makes it unique in the artist's oeuvre. As demonstrated by recent research, blue paper wasn't at all a prerogative of Venice, being intensely produced by central Italian and Marchigian paper mills such as Fabriano and Fermignano. Be that as it may, it seems probable that, together with the peculiar smoothened handling of the black chalk and the rounded facial types, Popham's eye was caught by the adoption of a support and a drawing technique rare among Raphael's attested work and, on the contrary, frequent in Barocci's production. Putting contemporarily Raphael aside and judging the sheet only from the point of view of Barocci's connoisseurship, I personally would have no chagrin in considering seriously, at least as an exercise of mental flexibility, Popham's suggestion. Arranging the pieces on this mental chessboard, one should observe that the BM drawing shows consistent variations compared to the painting, particularly visible in the arrangement of the child's body and in the gesture of the Virgin. These are not exactly pentimenti, but rather uncertainties of the hand in the governance of the whole composition. The face of the Virgin is definitely stiff, the nose too pointed and the mouth misplaced. Compared to it, the shoulder and the breast are too small and flat, the typical kind of mistakes that a rookie copying from a given model may do, while the legs, shown under the drapery, are unresolved. The child, on the contrary, is quite well understood, but that's also the more independent part from the Foligno Madonna. Barocci's fascination for the Foligno altarpiece is well attested. In 1627, soon after his death, the historian from Foligno, Ludovico Jacobilli, wrote in his biography of the Blessed Angelina Corbara, apparently reporting a personal memory, that Barocci, quote, could never stop to make praises of the naked little angel in the middle, close to the eye. And I gladly report the testimony of such a man as a person of excellent value and well known in his profession. As a matter of fact, Federico had dealt with the composition many times, re-elaborating it in his circa 1567 Fossombrone Madonna, and studying the pointing figure on the left in a drawing in Philadelphia, which incidentally was also attributed to him by Popham in 1966. 10 years before, the Madonna di Foligno, together with a small round etching by Battista Franco, had already provided the model for the top part of the Martyrdom of San Sebastian. The latter was investigated in a drawing in Hamburg that provides what is perhaps the most intriguing comparison with the British Museum sheet. I am not implying, of course, that after more than a century of sound and distinguished scholarship, the British Museum study for the Madonna di Foligno should be took away from Raphael and assigned on the spot to Barocci. As usual, Popham was right in prudently stating that this is not an attribution which can be demonstrated. The episode, however, raises what I shall venture to define a fruitful consideration. We have seen how Barocci was able to digest and make his own some of the essential features of Raphael's style, thanks to his familial heritage, the access to the original paintings and drawings, and his personal sense and sensibility. Now I ask myself, if such a gigantic artist as Barocci was, at the peak of his capabilities and skills, had decided to imitate the subject and style of one of Raphael's work, would we, respectively 500 and 410 years after the death of the two great men, be able to tell the difference? Thank you for your attention.